Following the general election in the UK and the European elections earlier in the summer, and the recent regional elections in Germany, now's a pretty good time to take stock of where we are. We're having a lot of doom and gloom from the Prime Minister, and we're having a lot of pro-growth discussion, but one has to wonder whether in all of this there is a proper reckoning with Britain's economic problems. To me, there are four related problems, all of which add up to our desire to live well beyond our economic and indeed our environmental means. Put simply, there is not enough production, too much consumption, not enough savings, and too much debt. And if you unpack those four related, deep and fundamental problems, we have the start of trying to work out whether the current growth strategies are actually going to solve our economic problems. And it's not just the UK and Britain that's in this picture, it's also Europe. We have the major Draghi report on Europe's competitiveness, which points out just how far behind Europe has become to the United States and China. The chasm in energy pricing is just one part of that frame, but the lack of a production-orientated industrial strategy is another. So the UK is not alone. We're here in a similar position to all our European neighbours, but that doesn't solve the problem in itself, and post-Brexit, we have to find our own solutions. So let's start with the production side. The fact is the UK has been deindustrialising for some 40 years. At the beginning of the 1980s, some 25% of manufacturing industry went under in the great and sharp early 80s recession. And since then, we basically exited from our energy-intensive industries and indeed for much of manufacturing. We've decided that it's better to import than it is to produce. And the reason we haven't produced is because, well, there are much more competitive countries elsewhere. That has rolled on and on and on. And of course, it's flattered our territorial carbon emissions measure as if that was a sensible way of thinking about our impact on climate change. Politicians from Boris Johnson onwards can boast about how great our achievements of decarbonisation have been, but the reality is that the easy route to decarbonisation is, yes, close the coal industry, tick, that's a good thing to do, but yes, also just gradually close down those energy-intensive industries. How exactly closing Port Talbot and swapping high-quality steel for recycled stuff for the building industry, closing Grangemouth and turning it into an import terminal instead, how exactly these things help us in our economic growth strategy is yet to be explained. Of course, carbon has to be reduced, but you don't reduce carbon by closing down British industry and importing the stuff from even more carbon-intensive sources abroad. So deindustrialisation has been a long path. Manufacturing is now an incredibly small part of our economy, and the result is that when it comes to the supply chains, we really don't have them. Take a look at the net zero programme and ask yourself where the solar panels come from, 80% China, where the steel for the wind turbines comes from, China, where the minerals and rare earths come from for many of these new technologies, China. And that bodes ill for the great dash to net zero by 2030. But never mind, we're told by the Secretary of State that renewables are going to be that much cheaper than the alternatives. And presumably that means that we're rapidly going to close the chasm between the energy prices in the United States and indeed China and those in the UK? Well, my view is don't bet on it. It doesn't look as if developing those supply chains is going to be a walk in the park, and it doesn't look to me as if the closing of the energy price gap is going to happen anytime soon. So we have moved from production to imports, and we import more than we export, and that has a consequence across the broader economy. And in that part, we have, of course, continued to rely on consumption and retail sales in order to boost aggregate demand in the Keynesian narrative about how demand will create its own supply. Well, we're good at consumption. We really do consume, and we consume beyond the level that our production underpins, and we consume against a process over particularly the last 30 years of funding, and I mean funding, not financing, quite a lot of our spending by borrowing and essentially consuming at the expense of the next generation. You can see it in public expenditure terms. There is really not much hope that current policies of the government, indeed any extension of the policies of the previous government, are going to get a grip with the public expenditure wall that is out there in front of us. It's not just the ageing population. It's also what the current population is doing. There are growing health-related benefits, which look on a path quite different from most of our European neighbours and broadly our competitors elsewhere. We have a remarkable, about 20% of the workforce, who are just not working and not part of the workforce. That increased greatly during COVID for understandable reasons, but the UK has not gone back to work in the way that other countries have. And if we add to that our desire to cover the maintenance of our core assets, not by a charge on us, the consumers, but calling fixing the potholes investment, and then saying, well, it's fine to borrow for investment, we have a story in which we're not enhancing the assets. We're just patching up the roof, but we're borrowing to do that as well. That all underpins a consumption level which is not sustainable against the production of the economy. And indeed, that's now widely recognised from the recent House of Lords report right through to the OBR's projections going forward. Ageing populations will just make all of this much worse. And we live beyond our means, we consume too much, not just because of these broader expenditure pressures and the trick of pretending that capital maintenance is investment. We live beyond our means too because we don't pay for the pollution we're causing. And if you don't pay for the pollution you're causing, if the polluter doesn't pay, and that's you and me ultimately, the pollution doesn't go away. It's just a cost and a burden on the future. So, of course, consumption can grow. We can spend more, but only on the basis of increased productivity, increased genuine investment, and an efficiency drive to address the fundamental inefficiencies of much of our public sector. We need to be honest about what the sustainable level of consumption is, rather than pretend that we can simply go on like this and hope that somehow some GDP growth will come by the end of the decade and it's fine. It doesn't really matter if we borrow quite a lot to underpin that consumption. And remember, we import more than we export, so we have to rely on the kindness of strangers to lend us the money to pay for that excess of imports over exports. Now, that leads to the next of the four problems, savings, too little savings. It is quite remarkable that savings net of capital depreciation are approximately naught in the UK. You can argue about the precise numbers, but it's pretty hard to argue that they're anything other than very low. What does that mean? Well, it means every time the government wants to borrow to spend or borrow to invest, every time we want to borrow to build wind turbines, solar panels, houses, whatever, it's foreigners who have to provide the money. We have become overwhelmingly dependent, not just on the kindness of strangers to sustain a consumption in excess of what our production and our exports represent. We become almost wholly beholden on the kindness of strangers to provide the finance in order to do the investments that are part and parcel of turning the corner on the economy more generally. And that can't go on. We have to, at some stage, recognise that some consumption has to be foregone for savings. That British people have to save to invest. And that is a fundamental challenge. And right now, the government's approach to this problem is to try to bridge the financial gap it claims is out there, the so-called 22 billion, by moving towards the taxation of savings as opposed to the taxation of income or spending. And that's reflected in the proposals to tax not VAT, not income tax, not national insurance, not rises in any of these things, these core components, but instead have a go at people's savings, capital gains, have a go at people's inheritance and so on. Now, there may be very good reasons for doing some of this stuff, but one of them isn't that inequality is rising, because it isn't, and it hasn't been for quite some time. And it isn't a good reason if the impact of that is to further flatten the savings as we currently have them at this effectively zero band. Now, if you want to have more savings, you have to incentivize savings rather than tax savings. And where savings are already taxed because they are income, they come from income which has been taxed, double taxation doesn't solve our problems. And that brings us to the fourth, which is too much debt. Debt's just the consequence of all this. This belief that we can live beyond our means that someone else has to pay, and that's the debt. This belief that we can just invest, and indeed call capital maintenance investment, to get out of our problem, requires that we borrow. And it's not borrowing from us, it's borrowing from foreigners. And if you look at the debt to GDP ratios, we're going to go through 100% very shortly, and we're going to go ever upwards from that point, according to the OBI forecasts, unless there's a stunning return to growth. But of course, that requires reindustrialization, more production, and more savings, and as a consequence, less consumption to get to that result. Now, you may say, oh dear, that's all doom and gloom. I don't look at it that way. I think it's about brutal realism. It's about the state that we're actually in. And it's only when you recognize these four core problems, not enough production, too much consumption, not enough savings, and too much debt, that you have the chance of turning the corner. And we will have to turn the corner. We will have to get onto the sustainable economy path in due course. And it's a question about how painful that process will be. Better to do it ex ante as a clear act of government and policy than to wait until reality further catches up with us. And in that, we are in the same boat as almost all the other European economies, but that should not be a consolation. We should look hard at the gap between us and the Europeans on the one hand, and the US and China on the other, and ask ourselves, is it really sustainable to continue with that wide gap? And that wide gap is a function of essentially wishing to live beyond our means and favouring consumption over production. Thank you.